Hello, I'm Peter Apps. This is my YouTube channel, Battle for the World, and we're just over a third of the way through April 2026. This is the third of my videos for this channel. I'm in Tampa, Florida at the moment, home to US Special Operations Command, as well as US Central Command, which handles US operations across the Middle East. And it's the Middle East I want to talk about in this week's video. It's a story that you might think starts with Donald Trump, but actually goes back through the depths of time and the origins of empires. And it's already having a much wider impact across the world, not just in Europe, but also in the Pacific, on wars already taking place in Sudan and Ukraine, as well as the much larger potential conflicts with Russia and China. Now, as most of you will remember, this most recent episode of Chaos really kicked off at the end of February this year, 2026, when Donald Trump launched what he called Operation Epic Fury, killing Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and kicking off what has now been more than 2 months of military activity that has been grabbing headlines ever since. I'm going to talk a little later about what that meant, the blocking of the Hormuz Straits, the Iranian drone and missile strikes against what had once been seen as safe holiday destinations in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and beyond. But first, I want to go back and talk through what's really been going on in the Middle East in recent years, particularly the confrontation between Iran, the US, Israel and other foes, and then go back to where all that really started. Now, I don't want to get too dragged into the language President Trump has used around this crisis, because sometimes that just obscures what is really happening. To give one example of something that attracted arguably more attention than it deserved, his Truth Social post on April the 7th announcing that a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again, dominated the headlines for barely 24 hours before both sides were talking about a ceasefire once again. Now, US presidents threatening to end civilizations doesn't happen every day, and a lot of us felt more comfortable about the world when it simply never happened at all. But it does tell us some important things. The first is that it reminds us that Trump, more than any other president, is capable of switching focus quickly, or he has a short attention span, and that he views such threats as part of negotiations. The second point, which all involved might have thought about a little more before getting this deep into the crisis, is that those running Iran really do see it as a civilization and much more than just a country. This isn't the Muslim-Western clash of civilization simplistically talked about since and before and after 9/11. This is something much more complex and considerably older. For all the supposed simplicity when we talk about the West clashing with its rivals, the truth is that what is actually happening in the current era is that multiple nations and civilizations, many of which have been around for centuries and sometimes even millennia, are now rubbing up against each other, sometimes increasingly violently, across the modern world. That's particularly true with Iran, or Persia as it was known in ancient times. 500 years before the birth of Christ, the Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Empire as it's sometimes called, ruled by the Emperor Xerxes, ran from the heart of modern India to the Balkans, some 44 to 50% of the global population at that time. No other empire has ever come close to that in modern times. Even at their peak, the ancient Chinese and Roman empires, or the much more recent British Empire, never controlled more than about a quarter of humanity apiece. And while modern-day Iran doesn't have anything like ambitions on that scale, it still sees itself as a permanent regional and global player. Modern Iran is very different to those ancient empires. It's been shaped by a host of developments in the most recent century, including a US and British-backed coup d'etat in 1953 and the Islamic Revolution in 1979 that firmly severed relations with the West and put modern-day Iran on a collision course not just with America, but much of the rest of the current Middle East. In the more modern era, the Islamic Republic has built up its regional power primarily through the use of proxies. Initially and most significantly Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then more recently Hamas in Gaza and the Houthi militants who now hold much of Yemen. With the exception of Hamas, mostly these are Shiite groups lined up against the mainly Sunni other powers across the region. It's a dynamic that was further supercharged by the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. Within months of the invasion, US and allied forces found themselves attacked repeatedly by Shiite militia, almost invariably quietly backed by the Iranian Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps and its Quds Force, led by Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani. The result was a shadow war that often missed the headlines. Neither the US nor the British governments after 9/11 really wanted to reveal that it was Iranian-backed militia that were killing Western troops. That was then followed in the mid-2020s by a dramatic shift of loyalties. The US and Iran-backed Shia fighters found themselves alongside each other in the war against Islamic State, sometimes also operating alongside the Russians and other regional nations, including Jordan and the United Arab Emirates. The overarching confrontation between Iran, the US, Israel and the Gulf states, however, never really went away. And particularly from 2003 and the fall of Saddam Hussein, reports increasingly persisted that the government in Iran was doing everything it could to build a makeshift atomic bomb and the rockets that could fire it at its enemies. I'll probably do another video on the shadow war involving the US and Israel, designed to stop Tehran's atomic program. From the Stuxnet cyber attack to suspected Israeli assassinations, and then finally the Iran nuclear deal signed in 2015 between the Obama administration and Iran and backed by Britain, France, Germany, Russia and China. Israel neither signed nor liked that agreement, and it complained throughout the following years that Iran was continuing to quietly enrich uranium. Whatever the reality, the truth was that Iran continued to back its proxy forces across the region throughout the years that followed, including the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah in Lebanon. They also kept up their actions in Iraq, including a series of attacks in late 2019 and early 2020 against the US Embassy and US military bases. Throughout much of President Donald Trump's first term, his administration tried to avoid being pulled too deeply into the Middle East. For those who remember, there was a lot more talk about North Korea's atomic programs, as well as Trump's efforts to get on much more friendly terms with that nation's leader, Kim Jong-un. Still, even in his first administration, Trump showed himself more than willing to use occasional lethal military force in limited operations across the Middle East. Amongst the first and most significant examples came in February 18, when he ordered airstrikes on Russian contractors who threatened US forces in Syria. His most unexpected move, however, came at the start of 2020, when in response to the death of a US contractor at a base attacked by Iranian-backed militia, Trump ordered a drone strike at Baghdad International Airport, killing Major General Qasem Soleimani, head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, who had led Iran's secret warfare across the Middle East and beyond. When Trump returned to office last year, in 2025, he seems to have retained that belief that sometimes using powerful but limited US military force could bring him what he wanted, and at the very least keep US enemies in check. The Middle East was also now a very different place, and he seems to have believed he could use that to his advantage. The most important single event during the Biden administration that changed the face of the Middle East was, of course, the October 2023 attack by Hamas on nearby areas of Israeli territory, killing some 1,300 people in the worst violent loss of Jewish life since the Nazi Holocaust. Israel's failure to detect the Hamas attack before it started was a colossal failure for its intelligence services, as well as the high-tech and AI-enabled surveillance systems they'd used to track the thousands of suspected members of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Israel's other enemies. What those systems, often produced in conjunction with Western tech firms such as Palantir, had delivered, however, was an existing, growing, and almost limitless target list of potential Hamas members. Israeli officials were not exactly lying when they talked about the precision of their strikes, but they dropped so many munitions on often AI-driven targets, including in the heart of civilian sites like hospitals, that much of the Gaza Strip was laid waste in very little time. If anything, Israeli spies had even more information about what was going on in Lebanon, particularly because they'd secretly managed to sell electronic pagers to Hezbollah itself, now being used by senior members of the movement to stay in touch with each other as they attempted to avoid surveillance on their mobile phones. In September 2024, according to Israeli sources, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was told that Hezbollah was finally getting too suspicious and was about to send some of the pages to their allies in Iran to take apart and find their hidden secrets. With the window of opportunity closing, Netanyahu ordered the Israeli secret services to detonate the small amounts of explosives hidden in each pager, killing and maiming hundreds of senior Hezbollah operatives as well as some senior Iranian officials based in Lebanon and Syria. Israel's offensive into Gaza had already destroyed many of the rockets Hamas had smuggled in through tunnels with Iranian help. Now Israel's Air Force began a concerted campaign in southern Lebanon to destroy the significantly larger missiles and underground headquarters that Iran and Hezbollah had built together there. A campaign that would continue on and on and is still going on now in mid-2026. This was the beginning of what would become a concerted Israeli and then joint US Trump administration effort to tear down Iranian and other proxies across the Middle East. One of the next to fall was Bashar al-Assad's government in Syria, also a longtime Russian ally, which was swept from power in the space of days in December 2024 before Trump even re-entered office. Trump re-entered office with one obvious priority: to demonstrate his own power and that of his administration in as many ways as possible, as fast as he could. Iran was already looking weak, and Israel under Netanyahu was presenting that as the most immediate opportunity. The first real action to get underway was a concerted US campaign, Operation Rough Rider, against the Houthis in Yemen. It was an effort that did not initially get that much attention from the media, at least not until it turned out that new US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had posted some of the details on social media application Signal. The real point of that near 2-month campaign, though, according to multiple US officials, was to re-establish US deterrence, which Trump and those around him claimed had collapsed completely under Biden. When it came to the Houthis, that meant persuading them to stop their attacks on Red Sea shipping. It was at best a mixed result. The Houthis in the end promised to stop attacking US vessels, but still fired occasional shots at Israeli ships, as well as sometimes striking Israel itself. Conversations between the Trump administration and Israel, however, were already turning to a bigger target: Iran's atomic program. Trump's strikes in June 2025, using enormous bunker-busting bombs against Iran's main atomic bunker at Natanz, was designed not just to wreck Tehran's atomic program, but again to convince the leadership of Tehran and other nations that the US was serious when it came to taking military action. The problem with taking such steps, of course, is that they can end up becoming quite addictive. And while each supposedly successful use of force can make future threats aimed at other foes sound somewhat more convincing, that effect can diminish over time. And that, of course, is what seems to have been happening since the start of 2026. Trump began the year by delivering a change of leadership in Venezuela, moved on in a matter of weeks to threatening Greenland, and then began threatening US military force against the rulers in Tehran if they did not stop their brutal crackdown against protesters. That warning, though, seems to have had little effect on those running Iran, and Trump's frustration over that and the fear of looking weak, together with Israeli encouragement that the regime might be on the edge of complete collapse, appears to have been just enough to persuade the president to launch Operation Epic Fury and take out much of the Iranian leadership, despite heavily reported caution from many of those around him. Exactly how much choice Trump felt he really had is a matter for conjecture. It's possible the Israelis threatened to move against the Ayatollah anyway, but it's also entirely possible that they lacked the confidence or the capability to do so unless the US acted first. According to some reports, particularly in the New York Times, some within the Pentagon, including top uniformed officer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane, warned from the start that the Iranian state was much more resilient than the Israelis claimed. There are also disputed reports over whether Trump was told the Iranians were likely to move to close Hormuz. In summer 2025, Iran had retaliated for the bombing of its atomic bunkers with a single missile strike aimed at US forces in Qatar. But its 2026 retaliation was much, much broader, slamming into bases and apartments, even airports and military locations in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait and Bahrain, and even more importantly, at shipping in the Gulf. The result was a further stepped up US campaign. Pentagon officials talk in terms of hitting thousands of targets in the first 2 months, aimed at massively degrading Iran's ability to manufacture the drones and missiles it was firing at its enemies. And yet, it was still not quite enough. Earlier in the crisis, I described it to a UK tabloid newspaper as a geopolitical minefield that all sides were trying to slowly extract themselves from without showing too much weakness. That definitely goes for the Americans, but also the Iranians, the Israelis and the Gulf states. And it even goes for other players such as the Pakistanis, who somehow find themselves at the heart of negotiations, but also find those negotiations often going nowhere. Looking at this crisis from the perspective of the recent past, you can see how the Trump administration wound up in this situation and how difficult it now finds it to extract itself. All of this is now going on as global supply chains tighten for lack of oil and gas, with particular sectors, including fertilizer and pharmaceuticals, likely to find themselves amongst the next in serious trouble. And that, of course, is one of the reasons I expect this problem to gradually resolve itself, although quite possibly not before it's done some hefty damage to the global economy and possibly pushed some countries into outright crisis and recession. What makes this so particularly hard, of course, is that this is now about so much more than the Middle East. It overlaps with every other US relationship in the world, including that between Washington and China, with Beijing watching with what may well be a degree of satisfaction as the US tears up its partnerships with multiple other nations. In happier times, this is the sort of crisis one might turn to the United Nations for. But as things stand, all resolutions at the UN Security Council, introduced by the Gulf states and backed by the US and much of Europe, have put the blame so firmly on Iran that it seems to threaten further military action if shipping doesn't flow, and as a result have been blocked by the vetoes of both Moscow and Beijing. For some in Europe, including the EU Foreign Policy Supremo and former Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, Trump's actions in the Middle East are beyond the pale, particularly compared to Vladimir Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. For others, they sit well within the norm of what the US has done for decades across the Middle East, doing exactly as it wishes while Europe watches nervously. The US sees things very differently. Even amongst those who can't stand Trump, there are plenty in the foreign policy establishment who believe this war was always coming, and who believe the US military is doing something not just right, but vital. Those same individuals, of course, are often much more supportive of Israel, which has kept up its campaign in Lebanon despite its displacing huge swathes of that population. That points to a broader underlying view in Washington, though, that after all these years of messy conflicts, the US should be getting out of the Middle East, and that Trump is right in saying other countries, particularly Europe, need to step in and take the lead in the much longer future. So far, though, what those in Washington don't seem quite able to vocalize or even contemplate is a really detailed picture of what that really means. In the meantime, however, the combination of America's actions and the questions over its future focus have simply served to deepen the already growing relationships between Beijing and major Arab powers. That doesn't, however, mean Russia is benefiting quite the same, good news though the higher oil prices must be for Putin and his team. At the same time, they've had to watch Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky embraced by the most important Gulf states, with Ukraine selling its anti-drone and anti-aircraft weaponry as the answer to declining stocks of US-manufactured weapons. That should also be a reminder of the multiple other fronts that have also been shifting while world attention has been focused on the Middle East. It's not just that Ukraine has stabilized its front lines with Russia in many places, it's that Ukraine's domestic production of new weapons is reducing its dependence on the dwindling supplies it can get from Europe and Washington. As I wrote for Reuters earlier this month, matters have also been moving across the Middle East. That includes a visit by Taiwan's most important opposition leader, Kuomintang Chief Cheng Li-wun, to the mainland to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping. For all the talk of Beijing preparing to move against Taiwan by 2027, it now looks more like China wants to use that military posturing alongside a diplomatic effort in the hope that it can help the pro-Chinese Kuomintang party to win the next elections on Taiwan in 2028. If that doesn't happen, though, Chinese military force may be back on the table fast. As I said at the beginning, I can't imagine this crisis in the Middle East will last that much longer. But the longer it does go on, the worse the wider damage gets, both for the global economy and US relations with many of its friends. So that's me, Peter Apps, with my voyage around the Middle East for this new channel, Battle for the World. I hope you enjoyed this. Please feel free to send questions to askpeter@swc-ventures.com. Like, subscribe, and tell your friends. Have a great week, and see you back here soon.